Now, how about this idea, which was spouted by the former CEO of Exxon, Raymond Lee, I guess it was his name, right?
Mhm.
He was saying that the world will never run out of oil because if the demand continues, there'll simply be a transition to new technologies.
Okay.
Now, that hasn't been the case, has it?
Yeah, even within the peak oil community, there's an acknowledgement that the world will never run out of oil. It will just run out of the oil that as Jeff Rubin says, that you and I can afford to pay for. We can keep going with the world's oil resource and keep upgrading the resource to recoverable oil. It may be that at some point in the future, the next new barrel of oil may cost $500 or $600 to bring online. If someone wants to pay that amount in today's dollars, they certainly can. But technology is something that has improved global oil recovery at the margin. But here's a key thing to remember, Max. The oil age is coterminous with modernity. It's coterminous with modern science. We have always used the latest and best technology for extracting oil. We've been using the latest and best technology for 100 years. And especially in the last 30 years, we've used the latest and best technology. That's how we're able to turn dirt in Alberta into oil. That's how we're able to go down 5,000 feet and get oil. Doesn't mean we get out the oil quickly. It doesn't mean we get out the oil cheaply. We do get it and we bring it online, but it just comes on very slowly now at a very high expense.
Now, getting back to the politics of oil for a second, here's an interesting chart, I guess, or graph, which opens up an interesting line of conversation. The oil reserves around the world that are owned by countries versus the oil reserves around the world owned by corporations. My understanding is that corporations actually own very little of the reserves.
That's right.
The vast majority are countries. Is that
That's right.
correct?
That is absolutely correct.
So it's not for nothing then that you find U.S. military expenses seem to be focused in on countries that have oil reserves that have not yet been co-opted by American corporations.
Yeah, and just to this point, Max, we did. You and I lived during a time when the big giant oil companies like BP and ExxonMobil and so forth really did have some purview and really did have some control over sizable global reserves, partially because they too at one time historically were very much more deeply embedded in the Middle East. But now we live in an age where the global oil giants, what we think of as big oil, is really an industry that's in liquidation. It's not able to replace its reserves. It can't go anywhere in the world to replace its reserves. Now you're seeing companies like ExxonMobil and Chevron go the same route as Shell, which is they're essentially becoming more natural gas companies because it's really only natural gas that these companies can get their hands on.
All right, I want to get to fracking and natural gas here in a second. But first, let's circle back to 1971 here, because in 1971, some interesting things happened economically and politically. The U.S. under Nixon went off the gold standard because the U.S. dollar at that point was in deep trouble. The U.S. tried to pay for the Vietnam War. They went in deeply into arrears. The dollar was being cashed out for gold. Nixon closed the gold window. At the same time, you had this creation. It was Armaco, right? Armaco, the Saudi Arabian, got in bed with U.S. oil companies, and we transitioned essentially from a gold-backed dollar to a petroleum dollar.
Mm-hmm.
And this has been carrying the ball up until 2007. That's really this bull market. It can be kind of underlined by that relationship, which seems now has come to a screeching halt, because not even oil, because they're running out of peak oil, which was the buttress for the U.S. dollar since they hit peak oil and peak credit. This is what's tearing the fabric of the dollar as world reserve currency apart. Is that a fair characterization?
Yes, I think you can think of the period post 1971 to 2007 as the period in which the dollar partly derived some of its strength from the freely flowing availability of cheap global oil. You could almost think of the flowing of cheap global oil as a kind of velocity which occurred alongside the dollar. And of course, the dollar was the unit. It was the unit that everyone in the world used to pay for oil. And it's also, pretty astonishing that the U.S. went off the gold standard in the same year that its own oil production peaked. I have to believe that that actually is a coincidence. I don't believe that Richard Nixon was aware that the United States was peaking in its own oil production in 1971. Yes, Hubbard was around talking about that, but it was probably, that theory was regarded as a bit crankish at the time, as global peak oil is regarded now. And so then post 2006, post 2007, you had a confluence of a couple of new factors that came down to bear on the dollar. One is, of course, our 25 years of creating too much debt here in the United States and achieving what I would really refer to as a level of debt saturation here in the United States. The other factor, Max, is that we abused the privilege of having the dollar as the world's reserve currency. This may actually just be something that humans do. If you give them a powerful instrument like the dollar, which can be sort of infinitely inflated without penalty, that just seems like something that it's sort of a free ride that it's going to be very difficult for human beings to resist. Tasting that candy year after year. And so I think that basically came to an end in the last decade. And this sort of loops back to our earlier discussion. These very large systems are dependent on growth, and growth is dependent on freely flowing cheap oil. And once the freely flowing cheap oil stops, the system stops growing. And then the expansion of money and credit also stops growing. And that's why you have our current problem today.
All right, Gregor McDonald, thanks so much again for being on The Edge.
Thank you, Max. It was great to see you again.
All righty, and that's going to do it for this edition of On the Edge with me, Max Keiser. If you want to send me an email, please do so at ontheedge@presstv.com. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.